Okay, my name is Glenn Kohler, and I'm a forest entomologist with the Washington Department of Natural Resources right here in Olympia. Not very often do I get to give a talk just a few blocks away from my house, so this is good. We cover the whole state, provide technical assistance to state and private landowners and managers. So basically any non-federal, non-tribal entity, we're here to assist with identifying insects or pathogens that you may have in your lands that you're managing, and also suggesting management options to deal with those, or whether or not they're at such a low level that it may not impact your objectives. Another thing that we do is some annual monitoring, and one of the biggest programs for that is our annual aerial survey that we do with the Forest Service. And we're mapping every forested acre of the state every year, looking for obvious signs like in this picture here of damage, and usually coding that with some kind of insect that we would associate with damage in ponderosa pine, like in this picture. But that is just what we're seeing from the air, just that signature of a red tree. That does not tell you what all the background effects are and why those insects are active in there. Or maybe it's not insects at all. Maybe it's root diseases. And so talking about climate change in relationship to insect and disease damage, one of the things that we have a pretty good understanding of from the research is that we can expect more frequent and intense drought. And the advantage there is that we actually have a fairly good understanding of how these insects and pathogens respond to drought-stressed trees, because drought has been a factor around for a long time. So there is a lot of research out there that's showing not only that we might expect more frequent and intense droughts, but the types of droughts and how severe they are is going to vary. And our trees in Washington, especially on the east side, every summer they're dealing with a drought. That's just a normal event for them for a few months to have that drought. They're well adapted to that. But when we start to increase those temperatures and have what people are calling hotter droughts, essentially, and that's a term that's actually been thrown around in a couple articles I'll show here, that increase in temperature, so drought is just a lack of water, and that's a pretty basic thing to understand. But when you add the higher temperatures on top of the lack of water, you're pulling a lot more of that moisture out of the needles, especially when the trees are active and transpiring. And if that water is not being replaced through the root systems, you're going to get basically a breakage in the water column, in the vascular system of the tree, transporting that water. If they can't keep up with that flow, sometimes this can happen if the ground is frozen in the winter and the trees wake up in the spring and start trying to transpire. You can get that break in the water column, but it may happen as well with drought. And I'm not a plant physiologist, right? I'm the insect guy, but I'll explain it in the best way that it's been explained to me, which is basically you're getting an air bubble in the vascular system of that tree because it's moving that water and pulling up air instead of water. And that break in there is going to make it very difficult for the tree to continue to move water up into the tops of the trees. And so you may get a red top where the tree has died above that breakage point in the water column, or you might get red branches. And so those are some of the symptoms that we see. So drought being a lack of water, the effect on our trees is going to vary quite a bit over the landscape. So it's not just as simple as lack of water. It relates to all these things I've listed here. The first three things, the maximum temperatures of drought, the season of the drought, and the duration, which is what I'm talking about, those sort of longer droughts, hotter droughts, that's going to be more landscape level effects. But the rest of these, the soil type, the drought tolerance of each tree species, the size of these trees and their root systems, those weather events like desiccating winds that might complicate this even more, the local competition that each tree is dealing with, what aspect it's on and the slope position, and where it is in its range of where the tree species grows. So not just range latitudinally. The farther south the tree goes, the more it might experience that drought stress on the south end of the range, but also in that elevational range when you start to come out into the lower country where a higher elevation species is getting exposed to more heat and stress. So that's basically going to cause a more variable pattern over the landscape. You're not usually going to see this sort of uniform die-off from drought stress. And the last one, what I'm going to talk about, these insects and pathogens that are already out there, most of them are native to our environment, and how they respond to this is going to depend a lot on how much of it is already out there. So you're already having a beetle outbreak, you have drought events, you're just going to have a lot more opportunity for those beetles to respond. So I kind of already covered this being summer drought being the normal condition. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor data from 2000 to 2020, so 20 years across Washington. The different colors are indicating the different severity levels of drought. 2015 summer was a pretty incredible drought year for Washington. And how far up these colors go on this chart is indicating the percentage of the state that's affected by that. So here is 2015 showing down here where you've got 100% of the state in one of these conditions, mostly extreme and severe, including Western Washington. So the normal years are just going to be these short-lived summer droughts, but then you start to get these that last much beyond that period. And so that can become a real issue for these trees. And this is what I was kind of hinting at. The natural droughts, the normal droughts are part of the system, and so they're not going to have major impacts on landscape change. It's just going to even out with those trees that survive and thrive after the droughts. When we start to see the severe droughts, then you start getting more widespread effects, but also a cumulative effect. So in that chart, it wasn't just 2015. There have been multiple years since 2012 where we've had these severe droughts. And so each tree that survives that event is just a little bit less capable of defending itself. Then we get into the more frequent intense, so the so-called hotter droughts. That's where we're going to see the potential for significant landscape changes, and what we're concerned about, where we're going to start to see loss of certain tree species on the fringes of the range. Again, latitude and elevation fringe. So the rising temperatures, in Western Washington, we've seen a number of years where we've had record days over 90 degrees, and that effect is building, and it adds to any lack of water, and so you start to see more of that temperature-induced relationship to drought stress. So, and again, I've already said that on the upper right. So it's really difficult to diagnose direct drought damage. What you're looking at is symptoms. There's not going to be some DNA signature or red flag that tells you this was a drought. But with the lack of any sign of insect or disease damage on top of this, and knowing that a drought happened, this may be what you're left with. So the pattern on the landscape might be more than one species affected. Worse on those marginal sites like well-drained, gravelly, glacial soils, that type of thing. And the damage can tend to be from top down and outside in, where the more vulnerable tissues of the tree are hit. And you'll see sometimes basically the symptoms you'd see if you weren't watering plants, bleaching, wilting, scorching pattern. And again, you're looking at these needles and you're not seeing any direct evidence of a foliar fungus or chewing from an insect or something like that. Some trees, if they're dying, will put on a lot of cones in an effort to reproduce themselves, referred to as a stress cone crop. In younger, like plantation-sized trees, you may see this where you get some Sunscald on one side of the tree, and that damage can lead to a fungal canker that develops in there. So sunken bark by itself from Sunscald, or sometimes you can get like this Phomopsis type canker as a secondary agent that comes in on top of that. And the dead tops and branches, what I was talking about with the breaking in the water column, so that's referred to as cavitation. is the word for that I didn't use earlier. So you're just seeing the dead top and the rest of the tree remains green or flagging, branch flagging, or dead branches. And you may examine the tree to determine what might have caused this damage. And in this case, you remove the bark and you would expect to see some kind of tunneling from bark beetles or wood borers, something taking advantage of that stressed tree, and there's nothing in there. So then you're left with the possibility that drought may be contributing to this. So the damage that you're seeing isn't going to necessarily, unless it's that wilting type damage, you're not going to see it the same year of the drought. It's usually going to show up the next year when these trees really start to dry out in the next hot season and that damage becomes evident. Or you might see it a couple years later if secondary insects or diseases like secondary bark beetles, which I'll talk about more in detail, invade these trees that are stressed. They may not do that until the year following the drought, and then their damage may not show up until that second year after the drought when the tissues they damaged dry out. So affecting all kinds of different species here again, and one of the ones that we've seen a lot recently with western red cedar, of course, but also western hemlock in western Washington, and it's very difficult to track that because the hemlock that have this damage, they drop their needles almost immediately after they've dried out. And so we don't get this red or brown or orange or whatever color you prefer flash out that we would see easily from the airplane and map on the ground that people would report. So there's a lot of hemlock mortality that's kind of under the radar, so to speak. But any one of these situations here, if you went and looked at these trees, I wouldn't be surprised if you found evidence of these secondary bark beetles. So they're called secondary because their typical lifestyle, they're not primary aggressive tree killers like the mountain pine beetle or the Douglas fir beetle, and that you might be familiar with, that have huge outbreak populations that can then overwhelm the defenses of even healthy trees on a large scale. These are really opportunists. They tend to be smaller bark beetles. All bark beetles are small, so think smaller than a grain of rice. But these are even smaller than that. And they typically like to go into stressed trees, suppressed trees, and branches broken in storm damage, slash piles, things like that. And so in normal years, they just kind of kick around in that stuff, and then they breed up populations and fly out and move into other dead material and just maintain that low level. But when we have these events like drought or fires or major logging, and pine is one of the examples where you can get a big buildup of these with logging slash, then if you combine that with drought stressed trees that are nearby, then you can start to see big populations of these, and they kind of switch from being secondary to more of a primary problem, and that's what we've been seeing in recent years. So in Douglas fir, being an important west side species, I just wanted to emphasize these. There's a Douglas fir pole beetle, that's this one on the top, and a Douglas fir engraver here, and another engraver. It's a different species name, but does not have a common name. These two are in the genus Scolitis. So this is the head and antennae here. The rear end of the beetle is kind of almost like something took a bite out of the abdomen underneath, and that's distinctive for this genus Scolitis. They're not rounded off like this Pseudohylocinus or the mountain pine beetle, Doug fir beetle group. The galleries that these make, I mentioned again, they're smaller beetles. They're going to be a smaller gallery than, say, those major beetles like Douglas fir beetles. So just a few inches long to maybe a foot long. Anytime you see this radiating pattern of a straight line tunnel etched into the sapwood or bark, and then tunnels coming out perpendicular to that, that's going to be bark beetles, not wood borers. And so again, smaller galleries are distinctive for these. Tend to be worse after droughts. I mentioned bark beetles in pines following logging slash. This Ips genus are known as pine engravers. These are really important on the east side. We have them on the west side, but they don't cause much damage over here. So they have multiple generations per year. Again, they're breeding in that dead material, small diameter stuff, and they have outbreaks when there's a lot of that material out there after storms or logging or fires. And you can see how with those multiple generations, they build up populations rather quickly, and then they move into nearby standing trees and kill them. And there are always these outbreaks, even if you have a lot of breeding material out there, if you don't have that drought event on top of it, these outbreaks tend to be less damaging. In your other species, like western hemlock, we have a silver fir beetle that prefers the Pacific silver fir, but will also hit hemlock as kind of a secondary agent. And there are other engraver beetles in hemlock that will do the same thing. So different types of gallery patterns. This one goes across the grain, sort of parallel to the ground if the tree is standing. That's the egg gallery created by the adult, and the larval galleries up and down from there. So that's the silver fir beetle. The Phloiocynus species in the western red cedar, which we have been seeing an uptick in western red cedar mortality recently, that is difficult to know, make broad statements about something that's happening over such a large area, but a lot of that is due to drought stress in these bark beetles. Little star-shaped galleries under the bark, not a clear line straight across, could be Pityoctines or Pityopterus or Pityogenes. There's a whole bunch of these. We actually refer to them as itty-bitty pitties because they're extremely difficult to identify. But anytime you see this sort of star-shaped tiny little tunnels, think secondary. Think this beetle's here because something else is going on with these trees. So back to this picture I was showing where you're trying to diagnose why a tree died and you don't see any of these galleries that I've been showing pictures of. Why is that? Why aren't these beetles taking advantage of that? It's possible there weren't enough of them around, or this tree wasn't attractive enough to them. One interesting experiment that was done in Europe with the European spruce bark beetle was they actually artificially tented individual trees to create this drought situation, and some of the trees were tented all the time so they got no precipitation, so extreme drought stress. Some of the trees were tented about half the time, and so they were experiencing sort of moderate drought stress, and then you had trees that got a normal amount of water. And then they challenged these trees by putting lures, pheromones, to attract the beetles to attack the trees. And the interesting result is that kind of as you'd expect, these more healthy trees were able to push these beetles out with resin and pitch and all their defensive actions that are kind of related to having enough water to do that. So those trees weren't really attacked. But the trees that were extremely drought stressed, the beetles didn't choose to lay eggs in those as often. And it may be that that inner bark layer that the bark beetles are feeding in is filled with sugars, so they feed in the phloem of the trees. And if that layer is dried up and is not as thick as it should be due to drought stress, sure, it's easy for the beetles to get in, but their offspring may not be as successful. And so that kind of moderate drought condition is perfect for bark beetle attack and breeding. Some of the major, so these are not necessarily secondary, but more primary tree-killing bark beetles. In grand fir, especially, this fir engraver, and this is another one of those scolitis that makes the egg gallery that goes across the grain parallel to the ground. So it's pretty easy to identify as kind of a post-mortem. And we're seeing a big uptick of this. It's real common in eastern Washington, but we're seeing a big uptick in grand fir in western Washington, again tied to these recent droughts. And this is showing some of our aerial survey data for the last almost 20 years here, from 2001 to 2018. And this is the drought monitor I showed you earlier. So you can see when you have these droughts that take up more area of the state and last longer, a few years later, you may see an increase in the amount of damage done by these bark beetles. And so there's a little bit of a pattern you can see here. And then after 2014-15 droughts, we are seeing an uptick. It's not quite as dramatic, as in the early 2000s. The 2019 data we have, and that's gone up to 130,000 acres, which is kind of right around here, and so continuing to rise on that one. So that's fir engraver. And then on the east side, there's a bark beetle that attacks only ponderosa pine. That's its main host, is the western pine beetle. And it causes this kind of clumpy pattern of mortality on the landscape where they gather in groups and kill trees. And that one is also really well associated with outbreaks following drought stress. And so a very similar pattern to what I showed with the fir engraver. Seeing an uptick more recently, again, nothing like we saw in the early 2000s. So just to emphasize that these events have happened before, and so it's not like we're dealing with anything we've never experienced, but if it happens more frequently, then we may see more damage off into the future. And I just want to emphasize, talking a lot about bark beetles responding to drought, and that's important for some of these species. But some others, like Douglas fir beetle and mountain pine beetle that I've mentioned, these other factors, wildfires, windstorms that create a lot of breeding material on the landscape, overmature, overstocked stands that are stressed from competition, not just drought, and the logging slash that can create that breeding material. So all of these factors can lead to major bark beetle outbreaks all on their own without any effort from drought. So just keep that in mind. Moving away from bark beetles, when you look at these trees that are dead and dying from drought, you may see evidence of wood borers. And most of the wood boring insects that we have are native. There are a few non-natives you may have heard of, like emerald ash borer or Asian longhorn beetle, that are problems in other parts of the country. Unfortunately, we don't have them here yet, but they're very similar in appearance to some of these. So you got the metallic wood borers that make kind of a D or oval shaped exit hole when they come out. The longhorn wood borers have these, horns are really just big antennae, and a wasp that actually does the same kind of thing. So they all have a grub that attacks dead and dying trees preferentially and bores around under the bark initially, just where the bark beetles are, and then eventually will dive into the sapwood and start feeding on the wood itself. And you've all seen those big tunnels going through firewood, and that's these wood borers. So the way to tell the difference, again, if you're trying to diagnose what's killed a tree, the wood borers are going to have a real random gallery pattern, a more worm-like larval appearance if you see them. The bark beetles are, again, grain of rice size. They are a C shape when they're resting, and their tunnels will tend to be parallel. They kind of avoid each other as they're chewing through. There is an interesting, just one example of a wood borer that can be more aggressive. So I mentioned most of them are attacking the dead and dying. This one being an issue more in sort of southwest Oregon, which is again is kind of a drought-driven system where you got a lot of Douglas fir that's living on the fringe of its range down there. But this is something that could become more of an issue for us up in Washington as things continue to heat up and Doug fir stressed on the fringe. So it's one of those flat-headed fir borers, metallic wood borer. And in this case, it's acting much more like a bark beetle, being a little bit more aggressive and able to go after trees that are otherwise appearing to be healthy. So completely switching gears from bark beetles to the pathogens. So root diseases are fungi that live under the ground. They're a parasitic, feeding on sugars in roots, essentially, and causing decay as they're doing that. And intuitively, we think of a fungus as needing a lot of water to grow, and so moisture soils, you think you would have worse issues with root disease. But counterintuitively, if a tree is under drought stress, a couple different things can happen. One is it's going to grow less tissue as it tries to conserve what it has. And so it may concentrate more nutrients like nitrogen and sugars into smaller spaces. And that can actually have an effect where the fungus that's parasitizing and trying to steal those nutrients and sugars is going to get more bang for its buck in a smaller area, and so those fungi may actually grow better because they're able to get more. But the other thing that can happen is a healthy tree is going to try to compartmentalize. So these are so-called zone lines in decaying wood that's got fungi in there. And a healthy tree is trying to stop the growth of that fungi through the wood and the roots and the stem. And it's going to need a lot of energy to do that, especially water and pitch to kind of flush those pathogens out. I mean, think of it like you've cut yourself and your body's first response to get the bacteria out is to bleed and move those bacteria out and get the white blood cells going. Trees are doing something very different, but a similar idea. And if they don't have the water and they don't have the nutrients are there, but they can't pull them up because the water's not there, then they're not going to be able to defend themselves as well. So we do see an increase in root disease damage related to drought. So not necessarily the fungus itself, but more of the damage. This is the Manion spiral, or also known as the death spiral. And essentially, I know you can't read this, but I'll show a more clear picture on the next slide. Essentially, you've got 3 different levels of factors in a tree's environment or inside the tree itself. They're all kind of contributing to the collapse or decline of that tree. The more of these you add, the more problems. That tree just starts circling the toilet bowl, essentially, and eventually it dies. So you've got the predisposing factors, which tend to be things that are more long-term, like the climate or the slope position of a tree, things that aren't going to change a lot. So those are predisposing the trees. Inciting factors are going to be something that triggers a decline. So an event like a drought or a fire that doesn't kill the trees, but it incites the decline of the tree. And then the final one is the contributing factors in here that essentially are the thing that actually kills the tree. And that tends to be an insect or a fungi or something like that. But all of these other things have kind of led up to that. And so in relation to what we're talking about today, the predisposing factors on the outside being climate change, a tree that's growing outside its adapted range. When it grew up there, that might have been its ideal place to grow, but that's changing now. The tree can't move, and so it's kind of stuck outside of its range. Low soil moisture holding capacity, and then the inciting factor being our drought that comes and goes, and then the contributing factors being the beetles and the fungi that I'm talking about. But it is very difficult to sort of put all this together to prove, to use a word that's not anybody's favorite in science, to kind of prove what happened is very difficult. And here's an example of a decline that has been happening recently in Western Washington. In the big leaf maple, you may have noticed these type of symptoms where you have crown dieback that's more chronic, occurring year after year, and you're losing branches. The leaves may have a scorched appearance or yellow-orange color, and some of these leaves were actually shrinking in size, so big leaf maple being very tiny leaves. And so there was a lot of effort to put in plots, take samples from my agency, DNR, to sort of find a smoking gun, pathogen or insect. And there just wasn't anything that was consistent across the landscape. And so further study, University of Washington got involved with a grad student. And what they ended up with was a whole series of different factors, none of which explained the whole thing, and put it down to higher summer temperatures, more extreme summer droughts, and human development factors. So here's an example of a decline where a lot of different things are going on, but can be tied back to the climate pattern. With defoliating insects, things like tent caterpillars and beetle larvae that might chew on the needles or leaves of trees, it's very similar to the root disease story, where drought stress trees can have higher concentrations of those nutrients that these insects want. And the western spruce budworm and Douglas fir tussock moth, which are, they're everywhere in Washington, but they tend to cause more damage east of the Cascades. And the reason that one of the reasons why we see that pattern is because east of the Cascades tends to be a droughtier site, so these insects can do better, and they can also cause more damage as trees are less able to recover. And the Douglas fir tussock moth tends to be more successful on the fringes of the host's range. So when you get Douglas fir and grand fir, their favorite hosts that are growing down near the sagebrush where the ponderosa is, these things tend to cause more damage down there. Sucking insects. This is another kind of counterintuitive example. Like aphids, scale insects. We have some examples of these in our forest trees. Oak pit scales killing white oak down in the Columbia River Gorge area, 2011. And spruce aphid recently, just this year, in coastal Oregon and Washington. So they're sucking the sap out of these trees. That's how these insects are thriving. And if you have a drought prior to these outbreaks of these insects, of course, you're already drought stressed, so having something suck all your sap out on top of that is just going to make things much, much worse and harder to regrow that tissue that these insects have killed. Foliar diseases, so these are little fungi that grow on the needles and leaves of trees. And these, we tend to see increases in foliar disease in falling weather events where you're getting increased moisture in the season where these fungi grow. So if they're growing in the spring and you get exceptional rains in the spring or fall, then you can have an uptick in these. And there are predictions that, not only droughts, but climate change is going to cause changes in precipitation patterns and when that's occurring and how much precipitation is coming. So some of these foliar pathogens may become sort of like a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, where ordinarily they were secondary, minor pests like this Phytophthora that we're seeing more issues with in Douglas fir wasn't really a known factor around here, and now it's becoming more important because the trees are stressed and they're showing more symptoms from that attack. All right, so the last few slides I'm going to show here, I put up the word potential in italics just to kind of emphasize that, most of my talk was about drought because we understand drought and trees fairly well. These are other factors that research has been done on, and so that they suggest that we might see some of these changes with a changing climate. But it's going to be really difficult for me to stand here and tell you this is exactly what's going to happen. And we're talking about 100 different forest pest species, and each one is going to have its own different way of responding. But just generally speaking, shifts in timing of when the buds break could be really important for these defoliating caterpillars. So here's a little tiny spruce budworm that gets its name budworm because it's feeding inside the buds even before those buds break out. So this little caterpillar is ready to go in the spring, and if for some reason the timing of that bud swelling and bud break gets decoupled from the timing of that caterpillar development, then the caterpillars may be much less successful. So this could potentially be a case where you've got a climate change effect that could be negative on a pest and good for the tree. There aren't many stories that might end up like that. On the flip side of that, though, the natural enemies of these caterpillars and things could also shift in their timing. And so whatever's controlling these populations, if that's not timed right, then the insect population can take off. And then with the foliar diseases, I already mentioned this, the changes in rainfall amount and the season when we see that rainfall could really bring up the scale at which, so this is a whole stand that's got foliar disease, like a Swiss needle cast, for example, could become much more widespread and noticeable. So warmer winters, I get a lot of questions about when we have bark beetle outbreaks and caterpillar outbreaks. Oh, if we have a harsh winter, Is that going to knock all these things back? And usually the answer is related to winter is no, unfortunately, because these things are really well adapted to hibernating through the winter, whether it's in the egg form or as an adult or whatever stage of that insect is set to go through the winter. It needs to get really, really cold to have an effect on these insects. So bark beetles, for example, some of them create natural antifreezes as the fall comes on, and they start putting more of these antifreezes out in their body, and they can literally get super cooled, so down to -40 Fahrenheit. They can survive to a temperature that low. But for some of them, they may actually be exposed or active during the winter. So one example is this Ips pine engraver I talked about. They overwinter as adults, and they don't sit under the bark, sheltered. A lot of them will just in the duff near the ground or in bark crevices, so somewhat exposed, and a harsh winter can knock them back. Other examples would be like these aphids or caterpillars that may be exposed and feeding during the early spring or late winter. The spruce aphid actually feeds in the winter. And so if they're active and exposed, a hard late frost can actually cause a lot of damage to these insect populations. So with climate change, if we start seeing those warmer winters, less action of late frost, that kind of thing could contribute to increases. So and then you got the insects are cold-blooded, and so longer development season, warmer temperatures on the shoulders of the summer season. These things they can feed more, they can be active more, and so they can do more damage. And if they have a real short generation time, so some examples, again, this Ips pine engraver I'm talking about, they have 2 generations per year in Washington, possibly 3, but when you get down in California, they have 5 per year. Western pine beetle here has 1 to 2 generations. California, it's 3 to 4. And so those shorter generations, you can actually pack another one into a summer season. Now the bark beetles that have a full year life cycle, it's going to be really hard for them to pack in a whole extra generation with just another month or 2 of warming temperatures. So it's not going to be the same for every insect. And another thing that we have seen evidence of is the expansion of the range of some of these things, especially on the latitude line. So this red blob here is the mountain pine beetle damage that has occurred in the last 20 years, kind of cumulative in the west. And during that outbreak, some of these areas of northern latitude that would be outside of this or below this sort of supercooling temperature that I talked about, ordinarily they wouldn't be able to survive in the Yukon. And now if there's trees up there, they're able to move further north, and now they're exposing new host trees that have never been exposed to these beetles before. And so this is kind of unknown territory, how far north they can go. And even if they get into the jack pine, so this is mostly lodgepole that they're in here, can they move through the jack pine, and could we have mountain pine beetle end up in the east of North America? It's an unknown question. And another thing they can do is move up in elevation. And so in Washington, I hope, we don't have a lot of places that gets down to -40. We got big, beautiful mountains, but usually when you get to temperatures like that, you're above tree line anyway. And so something like this is probably more likely to occur in the Rockies, where you've got trees above these sort of minimum temperatures for bark beetles. And I will just leave you at the end here with some general management approaches. Again, these are things that we already understand. And so just applying what we already know to increasing tree vigor, to making sure that we've got species on the site that are going to be able to tolerate drought more. And a lot of that might involve thinning to increase host defenses, making different choices about what species to plant on what site and what slope. And so we can use these things that we already know to plant the right tree, the right site, for the right reason, and also to encourage that tree vigor to defend themselves. I put up here avoid thinning during drought. Now, that's not always an easy thing to do because timber sales need to go through when they go through and the work needs to get done. And there's, you're not just going to stop working for 5 years because we're experiencing drought. But just being aware that when you do thin, those trees that you've chosen to leave behind aren't going to respond immediately to that thinning. So there's going to be a delay in their increase in their vigor and ability to defend against the bark beetles. So keeping that in mind, and then some of these other activities are important as well. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.